What if the most powerful weapon in the Cold War wasn't nuclear at all? Not missiles, bombs, or armies, but something invisible. Something inside the human mind. And if it was real, it wouldn't just change war. It would change everything people believed about control itself. And in the early 1950s, something began to surface that made people wonder if it already had. What started emerging in the United States after the Korean War was deeply unsettling. American soldiers were returning home after the Korean War, but not all of them came back the way people expected. Instead of relief or celebration, there was silence, detachment, and confusion. Some appeared emotionally distant, almost disconnected from the world around them. Others made statements that deeply unsettled military officials, expressing views that seemed sympathetic toward communist ideology. In the middle of a Cold War where belief itself was treated as a weapon, this wasn't seen as ordinary trauma. It was seen as something far more disturbing. A question began forming inside US intelligence circles, one that no one wanted to fully confront. Was this just the psychological impact of war and captivity? Or had something more deliberate happened? What if the human mind itself had been altered? What if loyalty, belief, even identity could be changed under pressure? That idea quickly spread across Cold War America under a single, terrifying word: brainwashing. The term itself had first gained attention in the early 1950s, popularized by journalist Edward Hunter, who described alleged psychological conditioning techniques used during the Korean War. Reports of American prisoners appearing to cooperate with captors or express altered beliefs spread rapidly through the United States. Whether these cases reflected genuine psychological breakdown, coercion, or Cold War exaggeration was debated even then. But the fear became very real, because if belief could be changed, then behavior could follow. And if behavior could be changed, then loyalty could never be guaranteed again. Once that idea took hold, everything shifted. War was no longer just about weapons, borders, or territory. It became something far less visible and far more unsettling. And suddenly, one question dominated everything. If an enemy could change how a person thinks, was anyone ever truly safe after capture? That fear changed the direction of intelligence thinking almost overnight. The Cold War was no longer only about weapons, borders, or military strength. It became about something far less visible: the human mind itself. The central concern was no longer just how to survive capture, but how to survive psychological influence. This led to action of the US military's most direct responses: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training, known as SERE. Soldiers were placed under controlled psychological stress, isolation, sleep disruption, and interrogation simulations. The goal wasn't to break them, but to expose them to conditions believed to mirror enemy techniques, so they could learn resistance. It was defensive by design, but it revealed how seriously the government treated the possibility of psychological manipulation. But behind the scenes, a very different response was forming. Instead of only defending against perceived brainwashing techniques, parts of the US intelligence community began asking a more dangerous question. If the mind could be broken under pressure, could it also be controlled? That question led to one of the most controversial programs in American history: MKUltra. It was a covert CIA research program officially initiated in 1953 under the chemist Sidney Gottlieb. At first, it didn't look like a single program. It was scattered, fragmented, hidden behind universities, hospitals, research grants, and front organizations. Even many of the people involved didn't fully understand what they were a part of. On paper, it was behavioral research. In reality, it was an attempt to push the human mind to its absolute limits and see what would happen when perception, memory, and identity started to collapse. To explore this, researchers tested extreme methods. One of the most well-known was the use of LSD, a powerful psychoactive substance that the CIA believed might help disrupt perception or lower psychological resistance. In some cases, it was administered in controlled settings to study its effect on cognition and behavior. Sensory deprivation was used, isolating individuals from light, sound, and normal reality cues. Sleep deprivation pushed the mind into exhaustion. Hypnosis and psychological stress techniques were also explored as possible tools of influence. And in some cases, subjects didn't even know they were a part of an experiment at all. These details only became widely known years later, after partial declassification and congressional investigations. One of the most infamous disturbing historical links to this era is Frank Olson, a U.S. Army scientist who worked with CIA biological research programs connected to MKUltra era activities. In 1953, he died after falling from a hotel window in New York. His death was ruled a suicide at the time. When classified documents were slowly released, that conclusion didn't feel so simple anymore. New questions emerged, new contradictions appeared, and the circumstances of his final days became one of the most controversial, unresolved stories tied to MKUltra. Not because of what was proven, but because of what was never fully explained. But despite everything that was tested, one result kept repeating. There was no reliable method of controlling the human mind, no stable way to reprogram a person into something predictable. Instead of control, the outcome was chaos, confusion, emotional instability, fragmentation, not reconstruction, but breakdown. Because the human mind doesn't behave like a machine. It doesn't simply accept new instructions. It reacts, it adapts, and when pressure becomes too intense, it doesn't transform, it fractures. This is where a deeper understanding of trauma becomes essential. Under extreme stress, the human mind does not simply change beliefs. It adapts for survival. Psychologists describe this through fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. And in situations of sustained pressure or perceived threat, individuals may unconsciously shift into these states in order to reduce harm. In particular, the fawn response involves adapting behavior to appease authority or reduce conflict, which can appear externally as compliance or sudden personality change. From the outside, it can look like transformation, but internally, it is survival. And that distinction changes everything, because it shows why MKUltra's central assumption was flawed. The human mind is not something that can simply be rewritten. It destabilizes under pressure. People don't become new versions of themselves. They fragment, adapt, and try to hold coherence in environments that make coherence impossible. Recovery from these kinds of experiences is just as complex. People often describe it as losing parts of themselves or feeling like they no longer fully recognize who they are. Life after such experiences is not a simple return to a previous self. It feels more like reconstruction, where survival responses, memories, and identity fragments have to be slowly integrated again into something stable. Psychological mechanisms such as cognitive dissonance make this even more intense. When reality clashes with belief, the mind tries to reduce the conflict. Sometimes it rejects evidence. Sometimes it strengthens belief even further. And sometimes Identity itself is reshaped just to maintain internal stability. And yet, across all of this research and history, one thing remains consistent. Identity is not permanent. Even under extreme influence, it does not lock into place forever. It has to be reinforced. It can weaken, it can shift, and it can be rebuilt again. It often involves losing emotional structure, social belonging, and identity at the same time. This is why change under pressure is rarely linear. It's not a simple shift from one belief to another, but a destabilization followed by gradual reorganization. Another related phenomenon observed in extreme interrogation contexts is the false confession. Under sustained psychological or physical pressure, individuals may begin to internalize narratives that are not factually accurate. The priority shifts from maintaining truth to escaping distress. In such conditions, the mind may accept statements or identities that reduce immediate suffering, even if they conflict with reality. Not because truth changed, but because relief became more important than accuracy. MKUltra ultimately did not achieve what it was trying to find. There was no reliable form of mind control, but what it did reveal was something far more complex. The human mind is not programmable. It is adaptive. It resists not through structure, but through instability, fragmentation, and survival logic. And even though MKUltra ended, the questions raised did not disappear. They evolved into new forms of the modern world. Today, influence is not confined to secret programs or classified research. It exists within systems of attention, communication, and digital interaction. Social media platforms and digital environments are designed around engagement, and engagement is often driven by emotional response. Content that triggers fear, curiosity, anger, or urgency tends to capture attention more effectively than neutral information. This does not mean modern systems directly control thought, but they do shape exposure and repetition. What is seen more often becomes more familiar. What is emotionally reinforced becomes more memorable. Over time, patterns of attention can subtly influence perception, not by rewriting identity, but by guiding what the mind repeatedly returns to. So, the question remains the same, just quieter now. How much of what we think is truly chosen? And how much is shaped by the environments around us? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because whether it's Cold War fear, secret experiments, or modern digital life, one thing stays consistent: the human mind can be influenced, but it is never fully owned. Even under pressure, something still remains: the ability to notice, to question, and to change direction again. And in many ways, what might be the only real boundary between influence that lasts and influence that doesn't.